Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
From tonight, Parliament will be shut down for 5 weeks. First, though, MPs will be asked to vote for a second time on the government's call for a snap general election. But that looks set to be rejected again. This afternoon, a law designed to prevent the UK leaving the European Union without a deal came into effect as it was given royal assent. The Prime Minister spent this morning in Dublin, where he said that leaving the EU without a deal would be a failure of statecraft. He was speaking alongside the Irish Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, who said that the UK had yet to offer practical solutions to the backstop, the insurance policy, to avoid a hard border in Ireland. Meanwhile, there were emotional scenes in the House of Commons this afternoon as the Speaker, John Bercow, announced that he was standing down from the role on the 31st of October. Our political editor, Laura Kuensberg, is in Westminster with all the latest. Laura.
Sophie, if you don't want drama, look away now. It's been another day of twists and turns in Westminster. The controversial Speaker of the Commons, John Bercow, announced that he's quitting, but not before the next episode of the whole Brexit saga is complete. The Prime Minister right now is having to listen to MPs held an emergency debate, trying to force the government to publish sensitive documents. And tonight, he's likely to fail in his bid to crash the Commons into an early general election. It's been quite a day, and our report tonight begins with some flash photography.
That's some guest book.
Michel Barnier has been here recently.
Boris Johnson's turn to put his name on the Irish Taoiseach's visitor list.
Donald Trump. Goodness.
He might be more at ease with the small talk than his predecessor, but the problem is much the same. What to do about the Irish border if there's no Brexit deal? Although this week, the Prime Minister sounded a lot more committed to trying than in recent days.
I want to find a deal. I want to get a deal. Like you, I've looked carefully at no deal. I've assessed its consequences, both for our country and yours. And yes, of course, we could do it. The UK could certainly get through it. But be in no doubt, that outcome would be a failure of statecraft for which we would all be responsible.
Awkwardly, the Irish leader made it plain he's seen no new solution from the UK yet to the backstop, the controversial insurance guarantee against bringing back a hard border that Theresa May agreed but Parliament hated.
I am ready to listen to any constructive ways in which we can achieve our agreed goals and resolve the current impasse. But what we cannot do and will not do, and I know you understand this, is agree to the replacement of a legal guarantee with a promise. We are open to alternatives, but they must be realistic ones, legally binding and workable, and we haven't received such proposals to date.
No sudden breakthrough in Dublin today, or at home, where Parliament's passed a law to try to make it impossible for the Prime Minister to take us out of the EU without a deal, which Boris Johnson wants as an option.
Order.
There's no more of a symbol of Parliament's right to resist Downing Street than the Speaker, John Bercow,
I would like to make a personal statement.
who in this long-running drama had a scene of his own.
My tenure as Speaker and MP will end when this Parliament ends.
In classic fashion, Mr Bercow, who's infuriated the government and was at the centre of serious bullying allegations which he denies, will go, but only after this latest round of Brexit controversy is done.
We degrade this Parliament at our peril.
That blast aimed at Boris Johnson, and he was applauded, but look where the clapping comes from. All too obvious, this is a House profoundly divided. And later tonight, the Commons will pack up for a few weeks, the government calling an early halt.
We will do everything we can to prevent the crashing out on the 31st of October and will support an election when that is clear that we're not doing that crashing out.
The opposition might block them, but right now it's the Tories who are in a hurry to get to the ballot box. And for a government with no majority, a parliament where there's no agreement, sooner or later, we're all heading there. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, at the centre of those talks in Dublin today was the so-called Irish backstop, which we have all heard so much about. At the moment, there are no routine checks on goods like food crossing the border. They're not needed because the UK and Ireland are both currently in the EU. But after Brexit, the 310-mile-long border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland will become the land border between the UK and the EU. If the UK leaves the EU customs union and single market and no trade agreement is reached, Northern Ireland could end up with different rules and standards to the Republic of Ireland. And that's where the backstop comes in, to avoid any checks. The insurance plan, agreed between Theresa May and EU leaders, will keep the UK in a close relationship with the EU until a trade deal is agreed. But some Conservative MPs fear the UK would be trapped in it indefinitely. Recently, though, there have been suggestions that the backstop could be made to apply just to Northern Ireland, creating a border in the Irish Sea. Well, our Europe editor, Katya Adler, is in Brussels. And this idea of a Northern Ireland-only backstop, is it seen as a suggestion that could unlock Brexit negotiations?
Well, the EU definitely thinks so, Sophie. It was its original and preferred backstop plan. It was Theresa May that asked for the backstop to apply to the whole of the United Kingdom. The EU thinks the Northern Ireland-only backstop ticks a lot of boxes for both sides. From the EU perspective, it allows it to protect its single market and member state Ireland and the Northern Ireland peace process. And the EU thinks from the UK perspective, it would allow Great Britain to make whatever trade deals it wants, while Northern Ireland economically could benefit from the advantages of both sides and politically could keep its relationship unchanged with the rest of the United Kingdom. Now, polls indicate in Northern Ireland that the majority there are in favour of the backstop, and recently the Prime Minister said he was open when it comes to trade in agricultural products for Northern Ireland to be aligned with Ireland. So why not for the rest of trade, asked the EU. But the EU knows that the Prime Minister, if he's open to the idea of the Northern Ireland only backstop, needs the numbers in Parliament, and there will be some unionist opposition for sure. Could he pull it off before a general election or after a general election? That's one of the reasons that EU leaders are very likely indeed to grant another Brexit extension if the Prime Minister asks for it. Yes, France at the weekend said don't take that extension for granted, but all the rest of my contacts across the EU say forget France, we know they like playing Brexit bad cop. If the rest of EU leaders are in favour of an extension, France is very unlikely to veto it.
Katya Adler in Brussels, thank you. Meanwhile, the Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow, has confirmed that he will stand down by the end of October and won't stand as an MP at the next election. In an emotional speech, he said it had been the greatest privilege and honour of his professional life to serve as Speaker. But his role in the chair hasn't always been smooth, as John Pinar reports.
The referee who became a player, loving every minute, as much as many Conservatives hated him, planned to challenge him at election time for siding with the Commons against a no-deal Brexit.
March on our way.
Speaker! But today he told them, come Brexit Day, he'd be off.
I have sought to increase the relative authority of this legislature, for which I will make absolutely no apology to anyone.
He'd stay in the chair and in charge till then. Not much joy on the Tory benches at that, but this was the Speaker's moment, an emotional one, as he thanked colleagues, friends.
And above all, my wife Sally and our 3 children, Oliver, Freddie and Jemima.
John Bercow seemed to revel in the dignity of his office, sometimes enjoyed putting MPs in their place.
I don't require any comment or signalling from the Honourable Gentleman. I'm giving a ruling. The Honourable Gentleman will listen to it, and he can like it or lump it. Be quiet. If you can't be quiet, get out. You're adding nothing, you're subtracting a lot. It's rude, it's stupid, it's pompous, and it needs to stop.
Hosting world leaders goes with the job. The Chinese leader was welcome, but not Donald Trump.
I would not wish to issue an invitation to President Trump
quite a career from fiery young Conservative
I may be an old-fashioned 21-year-old conference, but I make no apology for saying...
to grand office
Lots of people are annoyed at this decision. What would you reply to that?
to man in the news for defying a Tory government.
And I wish you a good day.
And he'll likely make another headline or two before he's done. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
Let's talk to our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg, in Westminster. So much going on in Westminster at the moment, yet Parliament is suspended from tonight. What happens now?
Well, that's right, Sophie. I mean, it's been a kind of whirlwind, helter-skelter in the last week or so. But if we just pause and strip out all the noise for a second and think about what's really going on, well, there's likely to be another couple of stormy hours debate here in the Commons tonight, and then that vote where MPs are expected to deny the Prime Minister his general election. But we have a Prime Minister who's adamant he'll be taking us out of the European Union at Halloween, whatever happens, even though MPs have voted to try to outlaw that happening if he hasn't got a deal in place. Because fundamentally, on the other side of number 10, you've got a Parliament that is resolute that they will not allow him to open what many MPs see as a Pandora's box of leaving the European Union at the end of October, or whenever it would be, without a formal set of arrangements in place. So despite all the tantrums, despite all the tempers, we are looking at two immovable objects, if you like. Parliament, this version of Parliament, intent on blocking us leaving without a deal, and a Prime Minister who won his place in number 10 by promising the Tory membership that that is what he would do, and he'd stick to a very tight deadline to boot. So sooner or later, even though Parliament is packing up tonight for 5 weeks or so, that clash is going to have to be resolved one way or the other.
Laura Kuenssberg, thank you.
Parliament is to shut down later tonight on the orders of the Prime Minister. The controversial measure means MPs will vacate the House for 5 weeks, returning for the Queen's speech in October. By then, Boris Johnson hopes to be close to securing a Brexit deal. And he was in Ireland today trying to get the ball rolling, meeting with the Irish Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar. Back at home, meanwhile, the Speaker of the House, John Bercow, announced he's stepping down, with his last day very possibly Brexit Day itself. Our political correspondent Paul Brand reports.
Michel Barnier has been here recently.
Having allowed others to get in with their negotiations first.
Donald Trump. Goodness.
It's one thing for Boris Johnson to finally sign the visitors' book in Dublin, but what about a deal? At a joint press conference with the Taoiseach this morning, the Prime Minister appeared to be limbering up for something, suddenly sounding far keener to get an agreement.
I've looked carefully at no deal, and yes, of course, we could do it. The UK could certainly get through it, but be in no doubt that outcome would be a failure of statecraft for which we would all be responsible.
But as for any sign of progress...
I don't think we're necessarily going to have a complete breakthrough here this morning.
Not today, anyway.
Not today.
The Irish Premier was awkwardly honest about replacing the backstop.
We are open to alternatives, but they must be realistic ones, legally binding and workable, and we haven't received such proposals to date.
The Prime Minister returning home with little to tell MPs. Lucky then that they'll be packing up here tonight as Parliament's suspended, but not before the surprise news that one member's leaving for good.
Colleagues, I would like to make a personal statement to the House.
The Speaker announcing another departure deadline of October the 31st, the latest he'll stand down.
This is a wonderful place, filled overwhelmingly by people who are motivated by their notion of the national interest, by their perception of the public good, and by their duty. We degrade this Parliament at our peril.
His role is meant to be impartial. The reaction was anything but. The government sitting on its hands as other MPs applauded. The tributes took up an hour. There are precious few left. Earlier, opposition party leaders met to discuss the final showdown tonight between Parliament and Prime Minister, as they refuse again to vote for an election.
We will do everything we can to prevent the crashing out on the 31st of October, and will support an election when that is clear that we're not doing that crashing out.
Her Majesty the Queen has signified her royal assent.
This evening, the bill preventing a no-deal Brexit on Halloween is finally law, signed by the Queen. But tonight, Parliament falls silent, and the Prime Minister will interpret its will in his own words.
Well, there is one other battle going on here before things wrap up tonight, an important one too. MPs are trying to force the government to publish all its communications, texts, emails about that decision to prorogue Parliament and about the impact of a no-deal Brexit. Downing Street says it will simply refuse to comply with that order. The question in the following weeks is, what else will the Prime Minister be willing to override?
OK, Paul Brand in the House of Parliament, thank you. So, in that countdown then to Brexit, there are a number of important events to look out for. As we've heard, Parliament will be suspended at the end of the Commons session later tonight. After 5 weeks away from Westminster, MPs will return on the 14th of October for the Queen's speech, before Boris Johnson goes to Brussels, hoping to thrash out a Brexit deal with other EU leaders on the 17th. Now, if the Prime Minister fails, the next day he will be forced to write an extension letter to delay Brexit until January. If he succeeds, though, we will be leaving on the 31st of October. And our political editor, Robert Peston, joins me now from Westminster. So, Robert, Westminster is Parliament suspending from today, but there is a huge amount, isn't there, still for the government to be doing?
Well, look, today is shaping up to be another absolutely disastrous day in conventional terms for Boris Johnson. Last week, you'll remember, that was the first week with Parliament sitting with him as Prime Minister. He lost 4 really important votes. He looks on course to lose 3 really important votes tonight, which would set something of a record for a new Prime Minister. Now, 2 of them seem to me to be really damaging for him. One is the one that will follow the debate that's going on at the moment, because that would force the Prime Minister to divulge confidential text messages, WhatsApp messages sent by his closest aides, which the person who organised the debate, Dominic Grieve, say smack of scandal, according to his Whitehall sources. Now, that is why, let's be clear, government sources are telling me they won't disclose those messages. But that would lead to yet another constitutional crisis. And then late tonight, Boris Johnson's attempt to force a general election looks set to fail. But let me be clear about this. I think he may have a trick up his sleeve. The vote will come just before midnight. I don't think anything can be taken for granted. We are heading for a general election. It may not quite come on Boris's timetable, but I wouldn't write that off just this second. Let's wait and see. All very tense.
Indeed. OK. Robert Peston at Westminster, thank you.
So now, after tonight, this is it for Parliament until October the 14th. As Downing Street confirmed, business will be suspended until then. If Boris Johnson gets his way tonight, that could be just a day before a general election, although his second attempt is just as unlikely to go through as the first. But right now, MPs are about to vote on an emergency motion that would force Dominic Cummings and other Downing Street advisers to publish all correspondence, including private emails, private messages about their plans for no deal and proroguing Parliament. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is with me now. What's going on there?
Well, the opposition parties, we think in connivance with Tory rebels when the vote comes at the end of this debate, are trying to get their hands on an awful lot of juicy material which they think will massively embarrass the government and expose exactly what the government's been up to in terms of seeking a prorogation and maybe not wanting a deal in Europe at all. Number 10 is turning around and saying you can't have all these iMessages and encrypted messages and the rest of it, because even if we did instruct those individuals to do that, that would be improper, because they are individuals and you can't just go trawling through people's messages. There is going to be one other debate, by the way, which the departing speaker allowed afterwards, about whether governments should obey the rule of law. I don't think the government's going to oppose that. I don't think there's going to be a vote on that. But again, that's there to embarrass them. Whether they actually extract material at the end of it, these sort of emails and iMessages and all the rest of it is another matter, but they think they're scoring a point tonight by even raising the matter and winning a victory against them. But maybe when you look at the ledger in all of this, there's Boris Johnson winning a victory as well, because this place is shutting down as he wanted it to at the end of tonight, and probably in the wee small hours. And I think he'll think, even though he hasn't got the election date he wanted, at least he hasn't got to bother about this place for a while. In terms of that ledger I was talking about, the fact that Speaker is going, a man who has made life incredibly difficult for the government, quite clear that plenty of people in the government are delighted to see the back of him. But I think in terms of its impact, the Speaker's precedents that he has created here, the difficulties he's already created for the government, I think he leaves a lasting legacy, and one they're not easily going to escape from, even when they've seen the back of him. I think one of the things that you have to ponder in all of this is that the government's options seem to be reducing, though. They're not getting the date they wanted, they're not getting everything their own way, and does that mean that Boris Johnson more than ever needs to try and focus on getting that deal, which he says he wants to get in the middle of October at the European Council? As for how that is going, well, it all started with an early morning trip to Dublin to see the Irish Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar. Boris Johnson proclaimed in Dublin he was genuinely seeking a deal. Leo Varadkar sounded like a man who had yet to be convinced. Eyebrows have been raised here at how long they've waited in Dublin for this face-to-face meeting.
Michel Barnier has been here recently.
The visitors' book showed many have beaten him here.
Donald Trump.
Nothing said in Dublin this morning suggested progress towards a deal was imminent.
We are open to alternatives, but they must be realistic ones, legally binding and workable, and we haven't received such proposals to date.
I don't think we're going to have, I'm just looking at the future, I don't think we're necessarily going to have a complete breakthrough here this morning.
Not today, anyway.
Not today. But
might be a good start.
But we are going to work at this.
Progress in negotiations seems even more important for Boris Johnson, as his room for manoeuvre back in Westminster appears to narrow. The government confirmed it will run this ceremony at the end of today's session, proroguing or suspending Parliament for 5 weeks. But other parts of the government's strategy are in trouble. Opposition party leaders on their way to talks with Jeremy Corbyn today.
Boris Johnson is on the ropes. I mean, all of these desperate briefings coming out over the weekend as he comes up with more and more, apparently madcap ways of trying to avoid the law.
All confirmed they would yet again combine forces tonight with Tory rebels to defeat Boris Johnson's attempt to call a general election on the 15th of October. Crashing into already febrile proceedings, the Speaker, who the government accuses of bending the rules to frustrate Brexit, announced he was standing down. But not until the end of the day the government had hoped Brexit would happen.
I have concluded that the least disruptive and most democratic course of action would be for me to stand down at the close of business on Thursday, October the 31st. Thank you.
Opposition MPs stood to applaud his efforts. The government benches were almost completely silent. Then some Tory rebels, now deselected, joined the ovation. He promptly irritated the government even more and was heckled by a minister as he announced he'd decided to allow 2 votes tonight on emergency motions, including one that demands sight of every electronic communication Number 10 aides have sent each other since they got to power.
It's got nothing to do with the procedural propriety. Don't tell me, young man, from a sedentary position what I can and can't say. If you're not interested, leave the chamber. I'm not remotely interested in your pettifogging objection, chuntered inelegantly from a sedentary position. The position is as I've described it, and quite frankly, young man, you can like it or lump it.
Senior government figures are talking about the courts being dragged into this row, just as they were over the decision to start the Brexit process. This time, civil servants could also be dragged centre stage, refusing to help a Prime Minister who's deemed to have broken the law. The Cabinet Secretary, perhaps, ordered by the courts to sign the letter requesting a Brexit delay.
Civil service could simply down tools and refuse to support the government, but my understanding is that there are exceptional circumstances in which the Cabinet Secretary can be called in to perform some duties on behalf of the Prime Minister if the Prime Minister is refusing to obey the law.
Jason Stein was a special advisor until 2 days ago, attending the internal briefings by the man who has shaped Boris Johnson's hardline strategy. Number 10 aide, Dominic Cummings. Is it a reign of terror?
I genuinely wouldn't call it a reign of terror.
What would you call it?
They're stand-up for political geeks. I mean, some of them are extraordinary. I mean, I've seen him bouncing around the room. He stands there at the front, pacing, delivering his instructions at a frantic pace. To his credit, he's always happy to take questions.
Does anybody really challenge him in that room? Is that the atmosphere?
Not really.
The government has won its battle to close down Parliament, hopes it's winning the battle for public opinion. But it isn't getting the election date it wanted, and that, it knows, could mean a very different election result when voting day comes.
Well, with me now is the former International Development Secretary, Rory Stewart, who rebelled, of course, and has now lost the Conservative Party whip. Isn't it very important that the government releases this information about no deal?
Well, I'm very strongly against no deal, but I think that this particular move is worrying. I think getting into the private emails of advisors is something that when I was the Minister and Secretary of State, I frequently thought was not a smart idea. It is important to be able to carry on the good business of government. So I have a slight technical disagreement with Dominic Grieve on this. So
you don't agree with the WhatsApp messages and the emails, but do you want to see the government's assessments of the impact of no deal published?
I'd love to see the impacts of no deal, but we know what the impacts are. I mean, I sat in Cabinet and saw those impacts. They're bad. No deal would be damaging for the United Kingdom, and it would be particularly damaging for farmers, it would be damaging to the automobile industry, which is why I voted against it. I don't really need an assessment to convince me again of the fact that no deal would be bad.
Amber Rudd resigned, saying the work on getting a deal isn't being done. When Boris Johnson claims he's making progress, he's got a proposal, he's trying to get a deal, do you believe him?
I think he's an optimistic person. I mean, I don't think that he's likely to get a new deal out of Brussels. I never have. I ran in the leadership saying the problem with this strategy is that he's not going to get a new deal out of Brussels and he can't get a no deal through Parliament. And so far, I'm afraid that seemed to turn out to be right. But he is a very optimistic guy. I'm sure he's sincere when he thinks he can get a deal. But I can't see how it's going to happen. You would have seen in the discussion with the Taoiseach in Ireland today that they're very clear that only with alternative arrangements in place would they imagine getting rid of the backstop, and those alternative arrangements are not being produced.
Right, so what about you as a group of independents? Are you voting generally as a bloc? Are you planning to work effectively as a party?
We will vote very consistently against a no-deal Brexit. We stood on a manifesto, actually as Conservatives, that said that we were going to have an orderly exit from the European Union, so we feel all of us, bar one, are ex-ministers, many are ex-cabinet ministers. We feel that it would be an irresponsible, unnecessary, damaging thing to do. But in other regards, we're loyal Tories, and we will be generally supportive of education policy, policy towards police, domestic policy in general.
Right, but you said tonight that you're opposed to Dominic Grieve's motion tonight. I mean, are you a rebel within a rebel group?
Yes.
I mean, is the rest of the group all voting with Dominic Grieve?
No, I think on this issue you'll find that we're divided. Some will abstain, some, like me, will vote with the government, some will vote against. This is not an issue on which we have a whip.
Now, you've also said that you're not going to join the Liberal Democrats. Is that just for now, or is that forever?
I can't see myself becoming a Lib Dem because I'm in a very unpopular position, but I'm somebody who believes in compromise. In fact, I have been arguing throughout that the reason why we need a soft Brexit is that we need not to get into the full Remain no-deal debate, that I think that would divide this country for 40 years. The Lib Dems, for perfectly honourable reasons, are committed to a second referendum and to Remain. And I'm worried that if we do that, you alienate half the population, just as if you do no deal, you alienate half the population. So I'm trying to get a compromise.
The government are saying if you want to stop no deal before October the 31st, your chance is to have a general election on October the 15th. Why are you not going for that?
Well, I'm trying not only to stop no deal, but also to try in a small way to save the Conservative Party and the centre ground of the Conservative Party. If we were to hold an election now, the Conservative Party would go into that without MPs like myself or the other 22, tied up with Nigel Farage and going for extreme policies that I'm afraid we would regret. And I think in the end...
The Conservative Party would win. So, I mean, you know, it wouldn't have an existential threat, would it?
Well, I think it's a threat to our system. I think it's important that we don't end up with Trumpian politics in Britain. Because we have a first-past-the-post system, we're always going to have these two big parties. And we need to fight for them to be broad churches. We need to make sure the Conservative Party has centre-ground people who are arguing for liberal, progressive policies, socially liberal policies. And I'm worried that if you become a version of the Brexit Party, then we are going down a Trumpian path.
Rory Stewart, thank you very much indeed. That's the division bell. I guess you're going off to vote with the government.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Right, over to John.
Well, now, the Irish government is adamant tonight that a backstop arrangement for the Northern Ireland border is an essential part of any Brexit agreement, unless a viable alternative can be found. Leo Varadkar has also repeatedly declared that the people of Ireland, north and south, will not let their peace and security be put at risk. Our correspondent Andy Davis is in Dublin. Here's his report.
If this had been billed as a bid to establish rapport between one leader and another, perhaps it was always going to work. Boris Johnson even remarked how well behaved the press were on his arrival.
Do you still think that it's like crossing from Camden to Islington?
Before later rolling his eyes when one of them mentioned his widely lampooned comments last year, placing the Irish border challenge in the context of London borough boundaries.
Prime Minister, first of all, I really want to very sincerely welcome you to Ireland, and I look forward to our conversation this morning. I think we can both agree that we have much to discuss.
And I know that Brexit was not, to be perfectly frank, a problem, a conundrum that Ireland wished for.
The diplomatic niceties flowed, but this is a crisis in urgent need of more than just political rapport. The Irish border question still suffocates this debate. Ireland insists a legal guarantee, the so-called backstop, is needed to keep it frictionless. Downing Street claims that could keep the UK bound by EU customs rules. Deadlock. Beneath the gaze of another old Etonian today, the Anglo-Irish alchemist and philosopher Robert Boyle, came an insight into Boris Johnson's latest creative thinking.
The concept of the unity of the island of Ireland for sanitary and phytosanitary purposes.
In other words, an alternative deal to the backstop, which would include keeping Northern Ireland and the Republic aligned in the agri-food sector post-Brexit. Quite a few cranes on the horizon, sign of a healthy economy.
There are 123 cranes on the horizon today.
So what does the boss of an organisation representing Irish businesses make of this latest proposal from the UK government?
I think alternative arrangements can't just be sector by sector. So while there is a lot of positive argument in using agriculture as the vanguard for this kind of deal, it won't be enough to satisfy the preservation of the single market. And for Irish business, preservation of the single market is actually really important.
A view which finds significant political support here, not least from Sinn Féin, who had this to say, having heard Boris Johnson declare there was still time to find a deal. How do you view Boris Johnson's government's attitude towards Northern Ireland, to the Republic of Ireland?
I think it's despicable, frankly, utterly despicable. I think they adopt an approach that is frankly ignorant and overbearing. I think
what's your evidence for
their
that?
lack of interest? Well, my evidence is beamed into my front room, sadly, from the House of Commons when I turn on my television, and I see the kind of arrogant disregard, as though we were an afterthought. We are not an afterthought.
In the centre of Dublin today, we encountered little appetite for the Irish government to change its Brexit border policy. Do you think the Irish government should be softening its stance on the backstop?
Absolutely not. No, I don't see any scenario where we could go back to a hard border on the island of Ireland.
I don't think it can be watered down now. I just
No,
don't
no,
see
I
that
absolutely
happening.
agree. No,
There's
not
too much
at all.
at
I
stake.
think we have to stick to our guns. It has to be. It's too important.
So it is.
Positive and constructive is how the two governments summarised today's meeting, but significant gaps remain, they stated.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
A day for handshakes, not breakthroughs then, as predicted.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Irish Finance Minister, Paschal Donoghue. After the British government said it was making progress in the talks, I asked him whether they are in negotiations with the UK over any specific proposal.
The only people who negotiate with the British government on behalf of Ireland are the European Commission. To date, the European Commission have indicated that no detailed new proposals have been tabled. But I think given that, that's why the meeting between Prime Minister Johnson and the Irish Prime Minister today, the Taoiseach, is so important, because it provided an opportunity for two heads of government to discuss the issue and see if there's a common understanding of the issue and a way forward.
And do you think there is something over which there could be a deal? What is it?
Oh, I think an agreement is always possible in political life. I mean, the views of the Irish government in terms of our need for the backstop are well known. But I think with the time that is available, with engagement between the British government and the European Union, there is possibility for agreement.
And is that compromise turning the backstop into a Northern Ireland-only backstop?
Clearly, the idea of a Northern Ireland-only backstop did feature in an earlier phase of the negotiations in relation to this matter and could play a role in moving this issue forward. The Northern Ireland backstop that is focused on the issues on the island of Ireland would clearly deliver the regulatory alignment and would clearly deliver the commitment to all aspects of trade and engagement on the island of Ireland that is vital for the Irish government and for many in Northern Ireland.
If no deal goes ahead, if there is no agreement, how sure are you that the European Union won't then put checks between Ireland and the rest of the European Union?
Well, firstly, what you're referring to there, I'm sure, is the fact that the European single market is something then that the European Union would look to protect. But that European single market is an Irish single market. So far be it from something that we will be made to do. Before the summer, we published a Brexit update to inform our economy and where we are. And we said in a no-deal setting there are things that we would need to do on our island to ensure that, for example, somebody buying Irish lamb will continue to know that it was lamb that was reared and slaughtered in Ireland in accordance with our standards and the standards of the European Union.
So where are those checks going to be?
Well, we're engaging with the European Commission on that at the moment, and the Taoiseach as recently as before this weekend said that in those kind of circumstances the checks will be away from the border.
See, I mean, a lot of Brexiteers will hear that and say, well, if they can do that, then that's the answer. There is no problem with the Northern Ireland border. They can do all their checks away from the border. They can preserve, they can pass on the problem of the integrity of the single market to Ireland,
and so,
effectively. And then it's not our problem, just get on with it.
So I don't pack that particular sentence, because what they're claiming is they can pass on the integrity of the single market to Ireland. We're not the ones leaving the European Union. We have not made that decision. We're in it to stay. The European Union is an integral part of how we've realised our political freedom and our economic progress. And in any of the scenarios we're talking about, as indeed your questions have illustrated, those kind of scenarios in a no-deal setting are ones that are very difficult for trade in our island. They're ones that will raise very difficult issues regarding our engagement with Northern Ireland. We want to avoid all of that happening, which is why the principle of regulatory alignment and why the backstop is so important. Any of the so-called alternative arrangements are ones that are really inferior for our country, raise issues for our economy and raise issues for our engagement with Northern Ireland. We don't want that to happen. And my question back to the Brexiteers, with respect, but I hope with clarity, is if they believe alternative arrangements are possible and if they believe they can play a role in resolving these difficulties, and we only see the backstop as being an insurance policy, then why not ratify the withdrawal agreement? And then why not, within the withdrawal agreement, use that as the space to scope out what these alternative arrangements could be, which of course we have indicated we would be willing to look at.
Paschal Donoghue, the Irish Finance Minister, talking to Krishnan earlier. Now, the former Prime Minister here, Gordon Brown, has said MPs should be debating what he called the devastating consequences of a no-deal Brexit instead of being suspended at the end of tonight. Mr Brown called upon Boris Johnson to respond to a series of concerns on what would happen to essential food and medical supplies from Europe in the event of no deal. Well, today, Cabinet Ministers have been giving more evidence to select committees in response to claims by experts about the impact of no deal. The British Retail Consortium warned a no deal would affect fresh food, its availability, shelf life and potentially cost, as trucks would be subjected to customs checks on the French side of the border. The consortium also warned the end of October is probably the worst time to face a no-deal Brexit, with warehouses already full to capacity with Christmas stock. And the former head of Brexit border delivery at HMRC warned that about 50% of trucks could turn up at Dover or Calais without the right paperwork for export, and that French authorities had warned that they could be held for up to 8 hours while this was sorted out, whilst in recent weeks concerns over availability of drugs and the negative impact on the NHS have also been raised. Well, today, Environment Secretary Villiers responded to MPs' questions as to whether there would be delays transporting food into the UK from the EU.
In the event that we do leave without a deal, then a huge amount of effort is going into ensuring that the Dover-Calais route keeps flowing. So your question assumes essentially both of those have failed. The exact impact on prices is hard to say, but we have acknowledged that it may be that if there are significant delays on the Dover-Calais route, that there will be more limited choice in relation to some fresh foods. And therefore some fresh foods will be harder to get hold of than they normally are. But we have a very resilient food supply chain. 50% of what we eat in this country is produced here. We also have significant markets outside of the EU from which we also source food. So we believe that the food sector is in a good position to respond to the challenges of a potential no-deal exit.
Well, here in the central lobby of Parliament, we are actually waiting for the result of the vote on the motion proposed by Dominic Grieve. Now, that is asking for the government to publish all its no-deal assessments, but as on top of that, it's asked for a load of private correspondence, emails, WhatsApp messages, other messaging app messages from a load of sort of close government officials regarding no deal and other members of Parliament. And the result of that vote is due in a couple of minutes. But with me while we wait for that are two MPs who've already voted. Former Labour MP Luciana Berger, who's recently joined the Lib Dems, and the Conservative Nigel Evans, who's very much with the government. And how important is this vote, Luciana Berger, and which way did you vote?
This is an absolutely critical vote today, and I expect us to win the vote, hearing the contributions that we've seen in the chamber. This is yet another dark day in our British politics. The fact that we've had to have an emergency debate in order to get from the government the repercussions and the implications of what it will mean for a no-deal Brexit in this country, and also that we're going to have to get the information and the correspondence and bring the Queen into it in order to expose the government and why it is that they are seeking to shut down Parliament today in order to silence our democracy. It's a very, very sorry state of affairs, and we'll see the result very soon.
But Nigel Evans, I mean, if they do win, the government's basically going to ignore it.
We'll see. There may be human rights implications, which I understand happen. I mean, under Tony Blair, this would never have happened. And certainly when Dominic Grieve was Attorney General, he would have told people where to go. It's only because we've got a paralysed Parliament at the moment. And the fact is, we'll see. But I'm like with Luciana. I suspect they'll win. But the fact is that we know some of the Yellowhammer stuff was basically the worst case scenario. If I told you the worst case scenario, you'd never get out of bed. I mean, seriously, you just stay in bed. And so a lot of this stuff has been way outdated because mitigation has taken place, and we'll see what happens.
The Yellowhammer report that we want to see the full details of, and what we've heard from and seen in the press, was the baseline scenario. This was experts from across the country telling us what the real implications are going to be for our security, for our access to food, for our access to drugs in this country. Very, very serious ramifications. We live in a parliamentary democracy, and on behalf of the people that we're elected to represent, this is about people's livelihoods, their ability to keep their jobs and to provide for their families. I think it's only right that we should see all of the detail that was contained within it.
To be honest, it's Project Fear on steroids, except, of course, after we leave the European Union, we won't be able to get the steroids votes, according to Luciana.
Do you accept, Nigel Evans, now that you're not going to be leaving the European Union at the end of October?
No, I do not. And
the law's been passed.
The Prime
It's
Minister.
got royal assent
well,
today.
it doesn't really matter. All it says is, unless we get a deal, then it's going to force the Prime Minister to go back
you're not
to
gonna get a deal,
Brussels. Well, I'm more optimistic than you are. We never know. You know, they were talking today, the Taoiseach and Boris Johnson in Ireland about other facilitated measures. I mean, actually, I thought some of the language coming from Leo Varadkar was a little bit more positive, a little bit more flexible than we've had before.
If the Prime Minister, by some miracle, comes back with some sort of deal that involves a withdrawal agreement rather than no deal, are you definitely against it now that you're a Lib Dem?
Well, I'm part of a party
Whatever it is, any deal you're against.
I'm part of a party that is standing up for this country and standing up for the implications of what Brexit will mean. First and foremost, our job today is to stop a no-deal Brexit. Let's be very clear, we've got a Prime Minister that wants to ram through a reckless no-deal Brexit. But yes, of course I want to stop Brexit.
So you will vote against any deal?
That's what I've done so far.
That's the policy.
Despite the referendum result?
That's what I've done so far. Because there's
policy.
no better deal than the one we've got already. And actually what we want is to take it back to the country with the people's vote and let the people decide, because an election is not going to solve anything.
This is wonderful. This is Luciana now joining basically an openly Remain party. That's fine. But to be honest, it wasn't really much of a step to go from the Labour Party under Emily Thornberry, which is to negotiate a new deal, put it to the country in a confirmatory referendum, where Emily Thornberry and the Labour Party are then going to campaign against their own deal. Yeah, I actually said that, and that is the policy of the Labour Party at the moment. Bonkers.
But Nigel Evans, I mean, you've been a long-standing parliamentarian.
28 years.
You've been a
Never seen
deputy
anything
speaker
like this.
of this House. You know how important democracy is.
Yes, I do.
Are you not a little bit uncomfortable with the way your Prime Minister has behaved?
No.
With regard to the prorogation of Parliament, with regard to telling people the real reason for that?
Do you know what I'm really more uncomfortable about is that we gave the people of the country, via this Parliament, the vote in a referendum, and 3.5 years on, not only have we not delivered that, but we've got people like Luciana and a load of people on the Labour benches who stood in a general election in 2017 saying they would deliver Brexit, giving them the impression it was going to be, you know, the Brexit the people...
Here's the results. Here's the results.
You're so convinced that the...
Here's the result.
The ayes to the right, 311. The noes to the left, 302.
So the ayes have it, 311 to 302, and that means that Dominic Grieve's motion has been carried, and that says that MPs are instructing the government to release this information. Luciana Berger.
Absolutely critical that we've won for them. I'm really delighted that we have done so, but it should never have got to this.
You're not going to get the information, are you?
Well, it should never have got to this, and the fact we've got a government that's not prepared to obey the rule of law, that you've got an MP here talking about human rights when it comes to obeying the rule of law, and other ministers saying that they're going to have to look into it. We live in a parliamentary democracy, and they should be ashamed of themselves. And in this dark day, thank goodness that we've got the result that we've just had now.
I hope somebody's scouring Dominic Grieve's speeches when he was Attorney General, when the Labour opposition would have asked them to reveal stuff.
Yes, as a man who used to preside over debates, are you really saying it's okay to just ignore?
No, of course not. You can't just ignore it. You've got to go. No, but you've got to go for the rule of law. So we'll just see what the human rights says about that. Because if Parliament turned around to a journalist and said you've got to reveal all your WhatsApp messages on a certain area which is sensitive, do you know? Most journalists would say, get stuff. You're not going to see those messages because this is under precedent.
What have you got to hide? Why wouldn't you release the information?
Same with journalists, Luciana.
If you don't think there's serious implications of a no-deal Brexit, why won't you reveal everything contained within the Yellowhammer report?
When you were a Labour MP, if you can remember back that far, a few months, under Tony Blair, a couple of years, there is not a chance. Oh, well. In those days, under Tony Blair, there's not a chance when Tony Blair was asked about Iraq.
But why have we got to this stage?
Isn't it true, Luciana Berger?
Parliament. They're shutting down Parliament today.
But you have overreached. You know, if you'd have just put it down to the government's reports, official papers, there would have been a lot of sympathy for that. But when you're asking for private text messages, people do wince.
Well, I think there's a combination of different issues here today. In terms of the information that we need that full disclosure on the Project Yellowhammer report to understand the full consequences of what no-deal Brexit will mean for this country, so that we can put to bed what Nigel's just said, because we know that it's a report that was put together in August. And in terms of disclosing the information, we haven't had honesty from this government. And the fact is, if you heard what Dominic Grieve said in Parliament, it's because very serious accusations have been levelled about the real reason behind why the government is seeking to close down Parliament.
You know what we need more than anything else is a general election election. Luciana has a chance to vote for that tonight. Let the people decide.
Well,
The only way we're going to resolve
the
this,
people
that
decide.
didn't happen in 2017.
the people decided in 2017.
And
Why don't you want to
2016?
accept their verdict?
And I'm going to deliver that if it's the last thing I do.
Nigel Evans, thank you very much indeed. John.
Fast-moving events here in Westminster. Let's get an update on tonight's debate. A defeat for the government.
Yes, the government's been defeated again, this time by a margin of 9, and this was on the motion that would require them to publish the messages on private phones as well as work phones, on iMessages, also any sort of electronic communication you can think of that might have been sent by people like Dominic Cummings, the Prime Minister's chief aide.
Well, that won't happen, will it?
Well, the government is digging its heels in very much so. The number tends to be swarming with lawyers today. Some of them, I assume, working on this. Some of them maybe on the bigger picture of what on earth you do with a parliament that is compelling a prime minister to do something he doesn't want to do.
But Yellowhammer might get published.
Well, in the past, this device that has just been voted on has managed to ease documents out of the government. The government's saying it won't go near any of this. It might, in the end, have to publish some stuff on Yellowhammer, which, of course, is the no-deal preparation stuff. But it's probably unlikely, you'd think, to get really into Dominic Cummings' mobile phone. And just now, Michael Gove, as he was winding up the debate for the government, was saying he thought the whole thing was ridiculous fishing expedition, and he even, for good measure, I think, slightly to goad the people voting for this, quoted the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 8, I think it was, on privacy, and how they mustn't trespass on that.